Russian soldiers are stuck on the fine line between life and death on the Ukrainian fronts. A series of failures on the front lines, lack of ammunition, inadequate training and nutrition, greatly demoralized the Russians. Demoralized Russian soldiers also did not believe in Vladimir Putin's war. When all these factors came together, the soldiers waited for an opportunity to escape from the front. The Kiev administration gave this opportunity with the I Want to Live project. Russian soldiers were crushed under heavy psychological pressure, especially on the Eastern Front. There were three options for them to flee, surrender, or fight. In the Russian army, fleeing is a near-death option while fighting almost guarantees it. But surrender can be an option for them to escape. The armed forces of Ukraine guarantees the surrendered Russian soldiers' life and human rights and freedoms. The main reason for the increase in the number of Russian applicants who wanted to surrender was that Ukraine's counterattack could start at any time. The Russians, who do not ignore this possibility, resort to the compassionate project of Ukraine to save their own lives. While the fighting in Bakhmut continues at full speed, the Russians surrender to the Ukrainian army every second or leave their weapons and flee. It was reported that around 13,000 Russian soldiers surrendered in March. In April, this number exceeded 16,000. Ukraine's I Want to Live hotline for Russian soldiers who wanted to surrender received 3,174 calls in April, an increase of 10% compared to the previous month. In May, this rate increased even more alone. Agents learned that the Rolling Stones complained of Los Angeles. In the past month, the Russian soldiers and army felt much more pressure and experienced a heavy psychological depression. It's estimated that nearly 7,000 Russian soldiers surrendered, especially in the last month. Surrender rates in May are an all-time high, averaging 200 per day. The head of the Ukraine hotline, Vitaly Matvienko, announced that more than 23,000 Russian applicants have surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces through the project since September began. When we consider all this data, we can clearly understand that there is a serious decline in the Russian army. A drone surrender has become quite popular recently among Russian troops. The moments of surrender of Russian troops to Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles have begun to be experienced intensely, especially recently on the eastern Ukraine front lines. The last example of this situation was seen in the city of Bakhmut, the most active front line of the Donetsk region. Let's witness together the most dramatic moments experienced by the Russians since the beginning of the war. While President Vladimir Putin's generals were polishing their medals for the Victory Day parade in Moscow, a Russian soldier named Ruslan crouched outside Bakhmut in a trench surrounded by death. A Ukrainian drone hovered above Ruslan while behind him, Russian mortars were preparing to strike. If he dared to retreat, his options were to fight, flee, or surrender. So what would Ruslan do in this situation? Ruslan's next steps were a PR blow for Ukrainians. The moment of a flesh and blood soldier surrendering to a plastic and metal robot was captured on camera. The striking footage came as Kiev forces made significant advances in the Bakhmut region this week, according to Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander General Oleksandr Kursky. A video shared around the world shows that the Russians signaled the drone not to shoot, and it was taken from the unmanned terrain to the Ukrainian lines. The drone combat aircraft team detected a Russian soldier who asked him not to bomb himself. The aircraft crew left him a note with instructions to surrender and follow a drone. The Russian soldier accepted the note left by the drone, even though his friends fired from behind him. Thus began the adventure of the surrender of the Russian soldier. The soldier went out from his trench to open ground and began to follow the drone. The soldier, advancing with the directions of the unmanned aerial vehicle, walked among his friends who lost their lives on the front lines. The march of the Russian soldier was accompanied by Ukrainian infantrymen and scouts. After the march, the soldier reached the Ukrainian positions. Unmanned aerial vehicles carry the hopes of freedom of Russian soldiers to the skies. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Mikhail Fedorov said that the soldier is currently in custody, and while the circumstances of Ruslan's liberation were unconventional, he's not the only one breaking ranks to escape the chaotic Russian war machine. At the same time, desertion in the Russian army is increasing. Official Russian government data shows that more cases have been filed against soldiers this year than any last year for deserting their troops. Meanwhile, by scanning social media posts and Siberia's cemeteries, brave volunteers willing to go to jail are collecting a more accurate picture than ever of the Russians dead. So what is life like on the front lines for a Russian soldier? Is it patriotism, pressure, or money that drives them to die in the Donbass mud? Ruslan, a former prison officer in one of Russia's brutal penal colonies, said he was mobilized in September with 300,000 citizens. Russian human rights defender Vladimir Osetkin, who spoke to the soldier detained in Ukraine this month and posted the interview on YouTube, stated that the choice for Ruslan is prison or war. Interviewing a POW is a gray area within the Geneva Conventions that protect captured soldiers from being made a public curiosity. The extent to which anyone in captivity can truly speak freely is questionable, and revealing their identity could endanger them when they return home. While Ruslan's narration is unreliable, it is potentially rare insight to the final moments of those who will never be able to tell their stories. Ruslan was enlisted as a Gefreiter upon arrival in Ukraine. The division will reportedly act as a kind of military police-keeping order among the Russian forces. However, in early May it was rumored that they will go to Bakhmut to replace the Wagner Group mercenaries who had left their positions outside the town. On May 8, Ruslan arrived outside the town in a troop transport. Here he was surprised to find that he and 3 of his fellow soldiers were handed over to the charge of a Wagner warrior. A Russian soldier spent hours in a trench. A mortar shell injured all 3, but when they radioed for help, no one answered. After these experiences, Ruslan chose to surrender to the Ukrainian UAV flying above him. So in which regions and how do the Russian soldiers surrender? The head of the Ukraine hotline, Vitaly Matvienko, noted that the calls came mainly from the Moscow and Leningrad regions, as well as Chelyabinsk, Novgorod, and occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. Last month, the Ukrainian military released an instructional video explaining how to surrender to a UAV to the Russians. The Ukrainian army has released an instructional video for Russian soldiers with a step-by-step guide on how to surrender to one of the drones. The video comes as part of Ukraine's I Want to Live project, a hotline that encourages Russians who don't want to fight in Ukraine to surrender. Soldiers who surrender are instructed to call the I Want to Live hotline to prearrange the time and place of the meeting. After the location of the soldiers are verified, the soldiers must go to the specified place at the exact time specified. Once the soldiers are in place, they should wait for the drone to appear. If the drone has not appeared, soldiers should wait for further instructions. When the soldiers see the UAV in the field of view, they have to make eye contact with it. Soldiers must then raise their arms and signal that they are ready to follow. After that, the drone will move up and down a few meters before moving at walking speed towards the closest representatives of the Ukrainian army. Finally, the drone will liberate the Russian soldiers who want to surrender. Ukraine wants to prove that salvation is so easy and close with a video it has published. At the same time, Kiev is paving the way for the surrender of more Russian soldiers with this humanitarian attitude. As a result, the glory of dying for Mother Russia is engraved on children at a young age. Since Soviet times, schools all over the country have dedicated their hero ranks in front of each class to a martyred soldier. Sitting at a hero table is a great privilege given only to the best students. The death toll in the war in Ukraine is a state secret, but the number of tables is growing exponentially. The Russians, who do not want to be included in these tables, leave themselves in the merciful embrace of Ukraine. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is cornered. Families of soldiers who were conscripted into the army with the decision of partial mobilization have started riots in many cities of Russia. The families of soldiers who were forcibly conscripted into the army and sent to fight in Ukraine want their soldiers back. Fires broke out in many regions of Russia. Russian families who gave Russian security forces a hard time created a great panic in the Kremlin palace. Vladimir Putin's decision of partial mobilization, one of the worst decisions he has ever taken, has divided the Russian people into Putin, who thought he could speed up the invasion in Ukraine by adding more troops to the army, was very wrong. Now he is paying the price of this decision. With the riots in Russia, all over Russia, Russian families and anti-war people have started to riot and organize protests for the end of Putin's regime by conscripting more than 300,000 Russian citizens into the army. Vladimir Putin failed to realize that his decision would have consequences. Unable to find soldiers to fight in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin first tried to recruit soldiers for the army by creating volunteer stands. However, when this was not enough, he sent prisoners from Russia to fight on Ukrainian soil through the Wagner mercenary company. But all this was still not enough to win the war in Ukraine. So Vladimir Putin declared partial mobilization and sent 300,000 Russian citizens to Ukraine, separating them from their families. Putin, who thought that he could win the war in Ukraine, may have gained an advantage in the war in Ukraine. But this decision seems to be leading to a bigger civil war within Russia's borders. Many war analysts have repeatedly stated that the majority of the soldiers that Putin included in the army with the decision of partial mobilization were chosen from the minority citizens living in Russia. As this news spread, minority citizens began to mobilize against Vladimir Putin. In addition, these minority citizens live in an autonomous republic, started to live in hiding in order not to be included in the army by Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin deployed the Russian National Guard just to include these citizens in the army. These National Guardsmen were in charge of finding and arresting minority citizens living in hiding. But the minority population who could not stand it any longer wanted to put a stop to Putin's aggressive behavior. The protests that started in autonomous republics such as Crimea, Dagestan, and Chechnya are now continuing in many cities across Russia. The people who took to the streets want the soldiers sent to fight to be brought back and this war to end. As for the details of the news, Vladimir Putin's assimilation policy, which has been practiced on minority citizens in Russia for years, continues under the pretext of the war in Russia and Ukraine. Putin, who wants to reduce the number and power of minority citizens, has settled many Slavic citizens in autonomous republics in exchange for land and money. Now, when it was learned that more than 200,000 of the 300,000 Russian citizens included in the army were minority citizens, the families of minority soldiers did not remain silent. The families of these forcibly recruited soldiers are taking to the streets to protest against Vladimir Putin and call for the return of the soldiers who were taken to fight. These protests, which initially started in regions like Crimea and Dagestan, soon spread to many cities across Russia. The protests that started in St. Petersburg, the city where Vladimir Putin was born, soon gave way to chaos. Russian families opposed to Vladimir Putin and the war took to the streets to show their support for minority families and called on Putin to end the war. In a short time, the number of citizens participating in the protests reached tens of thousands, and the protests gave way to a massive civil unrest. When people started setting fire to shops and parked cars on the streets, Vladimir Putin called in the Russian security forces. When the security forces and the city of St. Petersburg proved insufficient to prevent these protests, security units were sent from neighboring cities to support them. However, the people took their anger against Putin out on the streets. People gathered in front of Vladimir Putin's party building in St. Petersburg and set fire to Putin's party building. Russian citizens threw homemade Molotov cocktails at the party building, causing the building to burn as the Molotov cocktails entered the building through the windows. A huge fire broke out and the Russian officials in the building were quickly evacuated. Russian citizens surrounding the building stoned the vehicles of Russian officials who were evacuated from the building and tried to drive away. A large number of security forces arrived in the area and tried to quell the rioters. The protests that started early in the morning could only be suppressed late at night and the people were dispersed. However, the aggressive behavior of the Russian security forces against their own people did not go unnoticed. The Russian people used brute force against their own citizens, beating many Russian citizens. At the same time, thousands of Russian citizens were detained. According to the latest data published by independent news channels, over 5,000 Russian citizens are said to have been detained. These aggressive attitudes that Vladimir Putin has followed, both in foreign policy and domestic politics, are highly reacted even by his own people. Putin's aggressive policies caused the anger of the Russian people towards Putin to increase even more. In the first months of the war, the number of Russian citizens who supported Putin was quite high. They supported the occupation of Ukraine and thought that this war was necessary. However, in the first months of the war, the Russian people were not yet feeling the negative conditions and economic crisis brought about by the war. As a result of the support packages provided by the US and Western countries, see Ukraine, and the embargo and sanctions imposed on Russia, both the Russian army and Russia suffered a great disappointment. Not only did the Russian army's advance on Ukrainian territory come to a halt, but the Russian economy entered a very turbulent period. Many US and Western companies have ceased operations in Russia, while many others have decided to leave. Russian citizens whose purchasing power decreased with the increase in inflation rates in Russia slowly started to feel the bad conditions brought by the war. When the losses of the Russian army in Ukraine started to be announced, the Russian people's trust in Putin completely disappeared. In addition, the explosions and fires that have occurred in Russia in the last 2 months alone have shaken the confidence of the Russian people in Putin. The majority of the Russian people think that Putin is no longer able to secure Russia's borders and that they need a regime change. The young people living in Russia are fed up with the marginalization of Russia. Many experts, researchers say that the young and rich population in Russia is starting to leave Russia. In fact, according to the latest data, it is a known fact that nearly 2 million Russian citizens left their country with the start of the war. The young population, afraid of being included in the army with the partial mobilization decision, is looking for ways to leave the country. A while ago, Vladimir Putin made a major revision in the prices of airfare tickets abroad. With the 20-fold increase in prices, people in Russia became unable to buy these plane tickets, so they would not be able to leave the country. Vladimir Putin has introduced many new decisions in order to find more citizens to enlist in the army. Citizens involved in the partial mobilization were not even allowed to leave the country without a document approved by the Russian Defense Ministry. So Russian citizens went into hiding to avoid being drafted into the army and fighting in Ukraine. But there were those who did worse than that. Russian citizens began to harm their own bodies, voluntarily breaking some parts of their bodies. This way they knew that they would not be included in the mobilization decision. Although many state leaders criticized Vladimir Putin for putting his own people in this situation, Putin continued to keep his own people under control with his dictatorial attitude. In the Luhansk region, there were a lot of developments in an attempt to buy themselves more time to fix the hole in the front line. The Russians launched an extensive attack in the northern part of the region. Their main expectation was that the Ukrainians would be forced to shift their focus, relocate their troops, and lose progress in the central part of the region. However, this plan did not work very well, and here is why. Last time, after breaching the Russian defense line, the Ukrainians moved up to 5 kilometers forward towards Sofiivka and significantly diminished the Russian ability to supply and support the Volodymyrivka group. This was the first time the Ukrainian General Staff finally mentioned that the fights were taking place deeper in the region. And today, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that the fights took place in the vicinity of another settlement that has never been mentioned before. Picturesque. This means that the Ukrainians have also advanced from the south and are slowly trying to close the pocket around Kazivka. Overall, the situation for the Russians here is extremely problematic. Russian defense capabilities in Volodymyrivka have been undermined. The Russians in Kazivka are at a tactical disadvantage, and on top of that, the Ukrainians are cutting through the front line between these two defense points by advancing from the forest. And now they have also started closing a pocket from the south. The Russians tried to reinforce this region, but due to Ukrainian precision strikes, the Russians seem to have failed to generate a sufficient amount of resources to stabilize the front line. That is why the Russians recently did something different. They decided to once again activate the northern part of the front line, launch an offensive operation in an attempt to drive the focus of Ukrainian forces away from the Kazivka front, and maybe even relocate some troops back to the Kupiansk area to stabilize the situation. The Russians reportedly opened two lines of attack. Firstly, the Russians attacked Dvorak na Andreevka. Secondly, and more importantly, the Russians launched a series of attacks from Vilosana and Pershatravensk in the direction of Petropavlivka. The Ukrainians reportedly were not ready for a prolonged battle in this region, which is why, to strengthen positions in the vicinity of Zinkiv and Petropavlivka, they reinforced this region with an additional battalion and anti-aircraft missile systems. As the Russians usually conduct airstrikes on the areas of advancement, the Ukrainians have also improved their positions on the Orlanka-Kyrillovka line by setting up additional observation posts. As a result, Russian attacks were stopped relatively quickly in a matter of 2 days. Even though the fighting had been taking place in Vorekna, Haranim-Ivka, and in the vicinity of Zinkiv and Petropavlivka, the only settlement that the Russians managed to establish total control over was Mashivka. However, when I looked at the satellite footage, it turned out that the settlement consisted of 4 houses scattered across the forest. So no tough urban fights took place here. After stabilizing the front line, the Ukrainians are preparing to launch a counterattack. Russian sources reported that they noticed an increased number of scout groups operating along the separation line. On top of that, Ukrainian aerial reconnaissance has intensified significantly as well. On top of reconnaissance, additional forces have been deployed to the front. Certain subdivisions of 2 battalions were deployed to the area of the crossing over the Oskil River, where positional battles are still taking place. The Ukrainians also conducted rotations to substitute tired troops with fresh ones. And in the meantime, it was also noted that additional crews with Javelin anti-tank systems have arrived in Kupiansk and Petropavlivka to boost defense. The most important thing is that the Ukrainians seem to have managed to stabilize the northern front without compromising their offensive actions around Kazivka. There is a chance that the Ukrainians conducted a rotation of troops there at the expense of the Kazivka area. However, it is highly unlikely. All sources suggest that the Ukrainians pulled the resources from the northern part of the Kharkiv region. So Ukrainian reserves in the Luhansk area should have been untouched. At least that's what reports from the defense ministries and other sources indicate.